Hi, I'm Teresa Kittridge, your host of the 100 Real Women podcast, where I've set out to interview 100 real women doing amazing things for real communities. So you'll meet a couple of amazing women today. We're really happy to have you. And please, for folks who are listening, tune in each week as we give these amazing women the spotlight they deserve. So I'm just pleased to be here with both of you today. And I want to welcome and introduce Staci Gilpin and Charity Anderson to our 100 Real Women podcast. So welcome. And I am going to just do a brief introduction of Staci and Charity. And we met, I think, 2 years ago, right when you were maybe starting your organization. And we've stayed connected, which has been wonderful. And what I love about our relationship back and forth is we just like, hey, you might be interested in that, or I heard about some funding there. And that's really the goal of 100 Real Women, is to figure out, how do we better connect as women? How do we support each other as women? And how do we make positive impact in our communities? Staci and Charity are going to talk a little bit about their organization and about them. This is all about lifting up their work, their stories, and really showing how they built Rural Pathways, which I'm super excited about. So Rural Pathways is based in Duluth, Minnesota, and was founded in 2024 out of a deep commitment, and I love this on your website, of improving life in rural communities. Staci was born and raised in rural northwest Iowa on a small grain and livestock farm, and later lived in Itasca County. Through her role as Director of Special Education for 6 rural school districts in northeastern Minnesota, Staci helped over 1,000 students with disabilities and quickly realized that many service providers are based in the Twin Cities and didn't fully understand the unique needs of rural areas. And Charity grew up in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, and it wasn't until she moved out of Western North Carolina that she realized the vicious cycle of scarcity and the lack of opportunity that characterized her upbringing. While Charity's adult life and work took her to major urban centers like New York City, Chicago, and Seattle, her formative years in the country shaped her commitment to equity and sustainable development. So now we've gotten through our brief introductions, and I want you guys to talk a little bit more about you. But my first question for you to get started is, can you tell us a lesson you learned from an influential older woman in your life? It could be a grandmother, someone that really had an influence on you. I'll just hand it over to you.
Sure. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can. I had a boss in New York City, actually, that was my first sort of major job after graduate school. So this would have been around 2004. And her name was Christine Neptune, and she owned a gallery by herself. And I worked as her assistant there. And she now owns a gallery in Washington, D.C. And she taught me a lot about the art world, obviously, but she taught me about good supervision. I was the only employee there. We worked very closely together. She taught me about trust, about responsibility. I will never forget my first day working for her. She gave me a Picasso print to deliver. So it was like I had this very important object that she had entrusted me with, that I took on the subway to deliver to its rightful owner, and also just incredible compassion. So it was 22 years ago that I worked for her, and we have kept in touch ever since. And she has really made an effort to keep in touch with me and with all of her assistants over the years, which I really admire, and is something that I have taken with people that I have supervised and with students that I've had as well. That it's not hard to keep in touch. And it's meaningful. It's meaningful for me, and it's meaningful for the person that I've worked with. So I really admire her style of leadership, and her style of supervision. And I've tried to emulate it over the years.
I love it. How about you, Staci?
Well, I didn't have a grandmother or an older woman in my life in that traditional sense. And I know I'm not alone in that. Growing up on the farm with extended generations present, that wasn't my experience. I grew up in the midst of my mother's mental illness and really utter family chaos. And I think it's important to remember that just as rural isn't monolithic, we talk about a lot, neither are our experiences. And not everyone had that idyllic, multi generational household. And influential doesn't always mean good. Sometimes that shapes you, and most is what you had to survive or what you decided you'd never repeat. So when I think about where I picked up wisdom from older generations, it came in less conventional ways. A lot of it came from watching and listening, interviews with older women, memoirs I love to read, films where you see a woman who's lived a full life and speaks with a kind of like earned clarity. And there's something about hearing someone in their 70s and 80s talk about what actually mattered that really, I think, cuts through all the noise.
Right.
And then, there were brief encounters, older women at jobs. They've had a lot of jobs, which I'll talk about later. Passing conversations where someone said one thing that just stayed with me. I have lots of those little nuggets. And now what's really cool as I've gotten older, I understand it differently. There's that kind of wisdom that only time can create space for. And Charity and I talk about that a lot. And how rural pathways, we couldn't have done this 20 some years ago. But with all the lived experience and jobs and everything that we've been through, um, the time is right now. You can't rush that sort of things. You can't shortcut it. You just have to live long enough to earn it. And then I try to bring that into how I mentor younger women. Maybe because I didn't have that one person, I want to be that person for someone else. So I have a whole bunch of women that I keep in communication with via text. Some of them have been former clients, some of them have been former students. But keeping those connections, kind of like Charity talked about it, it's important to me too.
I love it. I love it. I hear you. That's what I love about this question. And actually, this question came to me from Heidi Holton, who is on KAXE, and she just said, that's just a great question to really, get in and get started. So thank you for your um, feedback and connection on that. So just starting out, what place or experience shaped how you understand rural communities today? And this can be, where you grew up, a place you return to, a moment that really changed how you see rural life.
I mean, I've talked about already, you've talked about it, Teresa. I grew up on a family farm in Northwest Iowa, and I graduated in a class of 29. And that really shaped my early awareness of how resources, access, and opportunity flow differently depending on where you lived. I remember watching decisions get made, in the cities. So in the cities for us, that would have been Des Moines. That landed completely differently where I lived, and noticing who was at the table when those decisions happened, and it usually wasn't us. And my dad was on the school board. Farmers, all of them, they're involved civically. So I was overhearing a lot of these conversations, and I picked up a lot. And then, fast forward years later, working as a director of special education across those 6 rural school districts, in northeastern Minnesota, I saw this pattern again. I think that's really when things came full circle. I was supposed to serve 1,000 students with disabilities. It was very different than serving 1,000 students with disabilities down in an Edina, a Roseville. The list could go on and on. Um, and I was navigating systems that weren't designed for rural realities in mind. I would often say, and people at MDE probably we're getting sick of it, but I say, "Well, come up here and show me how I can make this work." Because it works down there fine for you all, but it doesn't I cannot make it work up here. Um, we've got we've got a different culture, we have the geography, 1,000 students spread over, well, Itasca County,
Right.
plus a little bit of St. Louis County and Aiken, and I mean, you get it. And so that experience really, being inside the system and seeing its gaps, it really crystallized what, I sensed as a kid. And rural communities are better than, hand-me-down solutions.
But your Charity.
Well, I grew up in rural Western North Carolina, as we talked about at the beginning, in the Appalachian Mountains. And I've lived in cities ever since then. But seeing both made the differences more concrete for me. The differences in infrastructure, the differences in funding, the differences in political attention. And there's a historian whose name is Mark Banker. I think he's in Tennessee, but he has written a lot about Appalachia. And he said that the years that he spent away from Appalachia are what have made him a credible observer of the region. And that has always stuck with me and resonated with me because I feel like my distance has clarified patterns that are easy to miss when you're inside of it. especially how decisions are made, and how decisions made in urban areas routinely shape the outcomes in rural areas.
Absolutely, and this builds on what we just talked about, but when you think about, your personal connection to rural places, how does that show up in your work?
I think rural places are familiar to me.
Mm.
I understand how they function, the trade-offs that people have to make in order to live and thrive there, and how thin the margins often are in rural communities. And that understanding shapes how I work with rural pathways. I'm I think I'm a skeptical person by nature, and I'm particularly skeptical of solutions that look polished or perfect on paper, but wouldn't hold up in practice in a rural community. So, my work starts with the understanding that people in rural communities understand their own constraints. And what they often need is support navigating systems that weren't built with them in mind.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah.
how I try to approach work in rural communities, and particularly our work with rural pathways.
Mhm.
I love it.
Well, Charity, I'm glad that you're skeptical because that balances me out.
Yes. Yes.
It really does. I could not have. I don't. I In my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined a better friend and business partner in Charity. But what is my connection? So I'm a fourth generation farm owner, and I'll have to admit, um, I didn't really realize that I was a fourth generation farm owner until not that long ago. I spend a lot of time on the Iron Range, and when I would go to events, people would introduce themselves as, I'm a third generation Iron Ranger. I've had three
Yeah.
generations working in the mines and different things like that. And I thought, wow. Um, so so they're proud of that background. And I often felt like I wanted to hide that piece. And so I was like, "You know what? I'm going to start embracing that too." So it's just been recently that I've started sharing that. And it's really important to me because this legacy connects me to something longer than my own lifetime. It's generations of people who built something and passed it forward. And it really keeps me grounded in what's real rather than the abstract, because when you're working in a floodwood, when you're working in an Ely, when you're working in a, Hibbing, communities, they're in it for the long haul. A lot of times I've lived in urban areas, off most of my adult life, and people come and go and you don't even know. But in rural areas, people are gonna, in your community, the idea is they are born and they live their whole life and then they're buried in the community too, right? So to speak. And so I think that understanding is important. That people, not that I'm saying all areas are this way, but a lot of urban areas, they're so big and there's a little bit different values that the individual isn't valued as much. There isn't the history, perhaps. Like I said, you come and go. And, how does this show up then in rural pathways, in our work? Well, we're doing a lot of work in the childcare space right now. And, when I sit with a childcare provider in Silver Bay, right, just trying to figure out how to keep her doors open, I'm not coming in as an outside expert. I have never worked in
Right.
childcare. But I understand the context, the tight labor market, right? The employer who just announced layoffs. Economy's dependent on working the land. My dad worked the land. My family worked the land. That's the same up here mining. It's working the land. Driving 45 minutes for groceries or for care. I know what it means when the one grocery store closes or the school consolidates. And that understanding, I think, really shapes how I approach strategy and research. We don't bring solutions, we build them alongside people who know their communities best.
And when you think about your professional paths and, the work you do now, um, and communities you're most engaged with, and tell us a little bit about that. I mean, we're seeing the themes as they go through, but tell us a little bit about your professional paths.
Well, mine has been pretty winding, I guess. Um, and Stacy's too, for that matter.
Mine too. Mine too.
Okay, good. We're all minders. Um, so I started in the arts. I have a BFA in studio art and a master's degree in art history. And I went to college in Western North Carolina and then moved to upstate New York, Syracuse, to pursue graduate school there in art history. And my first professional work was in New York City at the art gallery with the boss I was talking of earlier. And from there, I moved into teaching, which I should also sort of note as calling back to that question about the influential woman, that Chris really supported me, even though I was a part of her business. When I said I wanted to go into teaching, she supported me with that change, which I think is also an important part of the way she supervises people, and something that I took to heart there. Um, so I went into teaching, and then from there, I went into social work and got my master's degree in social work and then my PhD. And that led me into applied research and evaluation in a position at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And then today, I co-lead with Staci Rural Pathways, which is, we are proud to say, is a woman-owned firm. We're based in northeastern Minnesota, so that's where a lot of our work is concentrated. But we also work pretty extensively, I would say, in North Carolina, which is where I'm from. And we have partners in other rural regions. And like Stacy mentioned, a lot of our work right now is focused on childcare, which was surprising to us when we first got started. But we also work in workforce development and housing and recovery services related to substance use disorder. And I would say sort of general community infrastructure. So we have a wide range of areas that we're working in within rural communities, but
Mhm,
childcare is a special area.
mhm. Yeah, well, Charity, my path is just as winding and braided together as yours. So yeah, I started out. I got a degree in elementary education from the University of Iowa. I grew up in that small community in Northwest Iowa, and I wanted to go to the exact opposite of the community I grew up in. So I went to the most diverse community that was possible to find in the state of Iowa still. And so I left with an elementary ed degree. I taught for a little bit in Iowa City. Met my husband, and I said I want to see more. So we had been doing a lot of vacationing up. That's what a lot of people do, right? Northeastern Minnesota, it's a playground. So we've been up here a lot in the Boundary Waters and things. And so, at that point we had nothing to lose, so we moved up north here. Gosh, it's been, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago now. So I spent a large part of my adult life. And I was a special education teacher. I was a special education director. I had always wanted to. I was always kind of nerdy in a way that people I'd surprise people. Um, I was always interested in statistics and measurement and research and um, you know analyzing things, but there wasn't really ever in my upbringing in the rural school I grew up in. There wasn't really space for that, especially for women and things like that. And so I didn't even really have the language or the understanding of what that would even be. But as I got older, nearly 45, I finally figured out what that would be. But then I was in Duluth, and I wanted to do a PhD program, and I really wanted to. I think because people had kind of said like you can't learn that, you can't do math. I did horrible in math in high school, statistics. So I wanted to do it right because people said you can't. But I couldn't find a program because my husband and I love Duluth. We had relocated enough times, and so I didn't want to move again. And so I was kind of stuck in a crossroads. Like, how was I going to get my PhD? Um, there were programs I could do that would have been okay, but I would have been settling. And I felt like, given my where I grew up and things, I felt like I'd settled enough. So the University of North Dakota, I remember I'd lay in bed and I would look on my phone every night. I'd be like, where could I go? I really want to do this. And one night, the University of North Dakota came up in one of my searches and I found this EFR program. So basically it's statistics and applied research. And so I messaged the person there and I said, "Hey, I really am interested in your program. I live in Duluth, Minnesota. There's no way I'll ever be moving to Grand Forks." As you get older, if you're younger now, you'll just become more and more direct with people. And so at the time, I remember talking with mailing with Rob, who I know very well now, and he was a professor of mine. And he said, "Well, let's talk. We can make it work." And so what ended up happening was and then COVID happened. I did my entire PhD and it was fully funded, which they've never done before for an online student. I was a graduate research assistant, this very, very rich experience that I got, which was a surprise to me. And coming from a rural area and just my background and things, this was the first time I felt like, gosh, I got a break. And the University of North Dakota, I mean, they're built to serve rural. I mean, all of North Dakota is literally rural. And so some of the work that I got to do with professors and things in the research around that really spurred things for me. But yeah, I kind of getting the PhD was something that I wanted to do. And it's, my trajectory would not be the same here. But I didn't know what the path would be. And once again, where you live does matter. And that's why I'm also a lot of my research was around intersectional and feminist lenses and really how higher ed does women a disservice online, and having the flexibility and access really makes a huge difference. So yeah, so I mean, I don't take anything for granted. And I'm always looking at how, I somehow the stars align for me. So how can we help other people connect the dots in our work?
And that's what I love about your work. And for folks who are listening in Rural Pathways, it's easy to find online. It's ruralpathways.org. So check out all the amazing things that Staci and Charity are doing. I just, when I hear you talking about, online and graduate students, and I think of, when I went back to get my master's degree mid-career, it was so hard to find flexibility. And so, yeah, hats off to North Dakota there. And hats off to graduate students, because that's really been the success at 100 Rural Women, are these amazing
Mhm.
students that I've been able to work with and to, access research and to be able to, make sure that what you're doing is adding value,
Mhm.
making a difference, something that's just like super important. So when you were younger, this is always a good question. Did you imagine, your future, what stayed the same? What are you surprised about? Are you surprised about where you landed? I know we all talked about how we sort of did a lot of weaving, but are you surprised, or what do you think? What did you think as a younger woman, a younger kid?
Yeah, I would say I'm surprised. I mean, all kinds of things have changed. I was a creative kid, and what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be shifted a lot, which is probably natural. I remember thinking um, that rich people had sidewalks. That's where rich people lived, were places that had sidewalks, and that I wanted to live somewhere that had sidewalks. So I did end up accomplishing that. But my path to where I am now has been very winding, like I said, and in some ways surprising, and in some ways not. And my brother Joseph and I talk about this a lot, actually. That life is strange, the passage of time is strange, and things are surprising and not surprising at the same time often. I think what stayed the same since I was younger is that I've never liked being told what to do, especially when it doesn't make any sense to me. And I've always questioned roles. and rules and structures and
Mhm.
decisions. And like I said earlier, I've always been skeptical. I think anything that felt arbitrary or disconnected from reality, I've had a problem with ever since I was a kid. Um, but humor has been a through line. Being able to laugh even in the hardest moments has mattered. And that's something that Stacy and I do a lot. I think we laugh every time we're together, every time we Zoom. We're laughing about something. Um, and that's important to me.
Mhm. To
And
the
has
point that my husband sometimes doesn't think we're working. But
right. You think we're having too much fun.
he just thinks we're having coffee. And I say, "No,
Right.
actually, we were working on an important
Right.
project."
But what has surprised me, I think, is what has happened recently, which is becoming an entrepreneur, which in hindsight makes sense. But Rural Pathways was not a long-term plan, really. It was more a response to limits that I felt I was facing, working inside of institutions.
Mm.
Um, so the through line there has been kind of basically just questioning systems that don't work, and wanting to understand who they serve and who they don't.
Yeah, gosh, Charity, no wonder we ended up as business partners.
Right.
Because I so many of those things that I was checking boxes right beside as Charity was saying. Um, and I think what's also really interesting when we think about, like why we so work so well together and Real Pathways has been successful is Charity and I have had different paths. I grew up as a standout athlete, and that experience shaped me more than I realized at the time. Sports was an escape for me from a chaotic family, but it also taught me that consistency and dedication matter more than talent alone. Showing up every day, putting in the work when no one's watching, pushing through when it's hard. Those lessons translate directly into leadership. And actually, I was reading something the other day about what makes businesses successful entrepreneurs, and that's what does. Um, Charity and I sitting here, and we're like, oh man, we have now been working on this like project or this initiative or this sort of like package that we're trying to market to a certain population, and it hasn't stuck yet. And we'll be like, but the last time, you start to learn we did this, it took about 6 months, and so really hanging in there. And then when it does happen, then it's like, yeah, then it's like we just have to stay steady. We know what we're doing. And that athletics gave me that confidence. In a small rural community, being recognized or something built a foundation, and I've carried that forward. As I moved into spaces time and time again where I had to prove myself all over again, no one knew me. I knew no one. That's happened a lot. And I didn't ever have a clear picture of exactly where I'd end up. But I always cared about fairness, making sure people weren't left behind because of where they happened to be born. And I learned early what it felt like when other people's decisions limited your potential. So I have a little bit of the story here. And I never had really, I haven't really told it ever like this. But here it goes. So until 1993 in Iowa, they allowed school districts to choose between 6-player and 5-player basketball for girls. Boys played 5-player basketball. What and 5-player is what you see on TV today. Women playing it all the time, men. 6-player, it was also called granny basketball, and it only allowed 2 dribbles before passing or shooting, and players couldn't cross half court. So it was essentially 2 separate 3-on-3 games. So, I mean, you can Google it. And some people that played it, I'll read online, and I just don't know what to say, said it was the best time of their lives. Um, but as a 5'4", really quick point guard, it was not the place for me. So rural school boards, made up mostly of men, decided that their girls played 6-player. It was a big thing at school board meetings, especially in the 80s when I was growing up in Iowa. In urban school districts, they played 5-player. They played the best, and I wanted to play 5-player very badly. I went to camps every summer. I held my own as a point guard against the urban girls. I could have gone to, Bishop Heelan, but my family didn't have the money to pay for me to go there. So I come back to my high school and I would play granny basketball. I was desperate to find a way for our school to switch, but there was no open enrollment in Iowa at that time. And, I was at the mercy of, like I said, the school board. And the reason, this is what really, at the time, I didn't know this, but it bothered me so much. I read and done a lot of research. The reason Iowa clung to sixth player longer than any other state, people loved going to the state tournament. It was entertaining. It was always sold out. It was a moneymaker. They published elaborate magazines featuring the high school girls basketball stars of the time posing with a basketball. It was almost like a Sports Illustrated for Iowa girls basketball minus the swimwear. And many of my own teammates, like they had drunk the Kool-Aid. I remember saying, like, why don't you want to play this? This is so much fun. And they thought it was too strenuous. Even research at the University of Iowa, I mean, this was a whole thing, showed time and time again that there were no health risks for girls playing high intensity
My
sports.
gosh.
And that's probably why I've only played high intensity sports my whole life. I've skied the Birkebeiner, anything like so, it was really gaslighting at its finest, right? So ultimately my zip code determined that I wasn't going to play college basketball. Colleges didn't recruit girls who played granny basketball. So I lost that battle. But some other high school girls and their families, they sued the state of Iowa, which it was really interesting. Some of this was happening as I was in high school, but they kind of kept it on the down low. And one year after I graduated, six-player basketball was finally eliminated, not because the decision makers in Iowa men wanted to, because the courts told them you have to. I never got the chance back, but it changed me. It left me with a chip on my shoulder and a determination that I would never again let a bunch of people, mostly men, decide what was possible for me or any other woman. And I've stuck to that my whole life. And it hasn't been easy, but today Iowa produces some of the best female basketball players in the world. Iowa and Iowa State right now, Drake, I mean, all over TV. It's amazing. And so the surprise was becoming an entrepreneur in the way Charity and I have. I owned and managed a farm, but I never imagined building something from the ground up, literally. Two dilapidated computers that we'd be restarting all the time, an idea, and some credit cards. But starting Rural Pathways, it turned out to be the vehicle that lets me do the work the way I believe it should be done. Relationship-centered, rigorous, rooted in community. And I think the through line that stayed constantly is working at the intersection of systems and people and trying to make institutions actually serve the communities they claim to support.
And I agree. Just sort of some of the things you guys have talked about. It's sort of like, building something it's amazing. It's really hard work. It's amazing to have it on your own. And I always think, why didn't I do this years ago? But it is sort of using the name of your organization. It's those pathways. It's some of the things that have led you to this. So when you think about we're living in a pretty turbulent world. What gives you hope right now about rural communities? And in particular, what about rural women? Like, what gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope or confidence right now is evidence more than optimism. So I was thinking about this and thinking about rural communities in North Carolina where I see women responding in particular to substance use disorder, and its kind of ripple effects through practical community-led work. They're building recovery supports, they're holding families together, they're filling gaps in very under-resourced settings, often, again, with very little margin for error. And these efforts function. And so that kind of evidence gives me hope when I see women adapting and negotiating and pushing boundaries and pushing institutions to respond rather than waiting for some sort of ideal conditions that are never going to arrive. That kind of thing tells me that change or underscores what I already believe, which is that change is possible, even when it is slow and contested.
Mhm. Yeah, I see rural women refusing to wait for permission. They're not sitting around hoping someone, down in the cities, big city will notice their problems. They're building solutions. And that's because that's what they've always had to do. They're scrappy, sometimes sophisticated, but they're demanding, seats at the tables where decisions get made. And, at Rural Pathways, we have the pleasure of working beside these fierce women every day. And let me tell you, um, the women that we work with are some of the fiercest I've ever met. And care solutions, that's something we haven't talked about yet, but that's emerged as a division that Rural Pathways, we're just soft launching it January of 2026. And, it came from listening to providers who actually need and are building, um, their organizations. And so, we work with, the intersection of, childcare, elder care, and pet care. I mean, those are 3 things that, land on the shoulders of women predominantly, and they get in the way of them being leaders, of them, doing businesses, having independence and things like that, and so listening to childcare providers in particular, and figuring out, well, why, like, for example, childcare, does it have to be the thing that it is? Do we have to be down 4,000 slots in northeastern Minnesota and just say, oh, that's just the way it is? We'll wait for the state, in 10 or 15 years to come and save us with universal childcare. And so through this, I met Chantel Gruba. She's now an affiliate with us, and Teresa, she's a fierce woman that maybe you should
Oh,
be on the
yeah.
podcast. Um, and she's the owner and operator of Iron Range Tykes in Mountain Iron, Minnesota, and and she was about ready to close her doors. Beautiful 8,000 square foot facility that's hemorrhaging money because that's the way childcare is. It's a broken business model. And, like, she doesn't need financial assistance. She doesn't know someone to go through her books with her. She knows there's just not there's not enough coming and going, bottom line. There's no other way about it. And so I asked her, well, what would it take? How much money would it take? What is the gap to make it so you would be like any other business? Because childcare is a predominantly nonprofit or owned by women. And so she came up with leveraging some tax incentives in collaboration with us. And now she's leading across the Iron Range. She's organized a task force. She's got funding from the IRRR and from Early Edge via MDE. And all across the Iron Range, there's a task force that she was integral in bringing together that are now bringing the business community to the table, having community forums, and talking about how can we solve this workforce infrastructure together. And so that's what gives me hope now are these small wins, women in rural areas saying we can't wait. And so we get to come alongside and help with this work. And so it really keeps us, I think, positive, even when we see everything around us
Uh,
happening.
Absolutely. Keeps you grounded in community and seeing these amazing women and just to follow with that theme, what do you think needs to change for rural women to thrive? Not just to survive, but,
Mhm.
to thrive over the next decade. What do you see?
I'll start with this, Charity, because I'm going to say I mean, it starts with care infrastructure, right? Um, I mean, it's the full picture. Like I just talked about childcare, elder care, pet care, everything it takes to keep a household functioning so someone can show up to work, let alone lead. Um, and, when a child care center closes, right? One just happened in Duluth here again. It's not a family issue. It's a workforce crisis, right? It's an economic development crisis. And, it's community survival. And who absorbs that, right? Often women. Same when grandma needs to go to a doctor's appointment 90 minutes away, women take off work. The biggest thing and I know Teresa, we've talked about this, when I'll say to a woman, like, well, why don't you run? I'll go to an event and there's politicians coming up to speak and they're all men. And I'll look at the person sitting beside me and I'll say, well, why don't you run for that office? And they'll, a big thing that will come up, oh, it's not the time isn't right, my kids are too young or this or that. But a guy would say, well, yeah, why not? Because there's different, that's not something that, that is part of, what in their minds, what is their day to day, right? What they need to manage. But also, care infrastructure, it's not enough if women aren't in the rooms where decisions get made. I, like you, Teresa, have been the only woman in many, many rooms. And, most elected officials in rural communities are still men. Most economic development boards, chambers, it's getting better, county commissions. And that's not an accident, it's a pattern. It shapes what gets prioritized, what gets funded, whose experiences, right, get taken seriously. And we can't keep fighting for scraps of attention from tables we're not even sitting at. But here's a harder truth. Before we can claim those seats, many of us have to change our own mental models. And Teresa, we've also talked about this. How many times women, right, need to be asked to run for office compared to like men, right? Too many of us are taught to make ourselves smaller, wait our turn, which will never come, to prove ourselves, 10 times over before asking what we need. And that conditioning runs deep. And rural women are already leading. We just need to stop apologizing for it and start expecting the investment and recognition that leadership deserves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good answer, Staci. I don't know. How do I follow that? Um, I obviously agree with everything that you just said, particularly that leadership needs to change and more women need to be in positions where real decisions are made, not just kind of consulted after the fact, if at all. We also need pay parity.
Mhm.
I think way too much essential work in rural communities, or really all
Mhm.
communities, especially in care and education and service positions, is underpaid. And it's underpaid because it's feminized and taken for granted.
Mhm.
And just like Stacy said, I believe strongly that care infrastructure needs to be treated as essential infrastructure. When we think about childcare, elder care, healthcare access, transportation, all of those things shape whether women can fully participate in economic and civil life, in rural communities, especially. So who is actually in the room determines who gets prioritized. And if you have all of these barriers around care and healthcare and transportation access, it's unlikely that you're in the room. And who's in the room gets funded, and that is whose labor is most often valued. So ideally, we would have more women in positions where real decisions are made. And I also loved what you just said, Stacy, about stop apologizing. That's always advice that I give to women, is that we say we're sorry way too much.
Mhm.
And that's something that I work on personally, is just to only apologize when I actually mean it.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. That language piece. And it's like, oh, sorry I'm late, or sorry I'm this. It's like
Mhm.
taking that word out of your narrative,
Mhm.
I think, is super important. And just a couple little things with county commissioners are a great example. Huge impact on our life, especially as the federal government is,
Mhm.
devolving, and the way our structure is in Minnesota. And we are in the upper teens with county commissioners that are women. The majority of them are in the 7-county metro area. We have a couple counties, in our regional centers, and then in a couple outlying counties that women are in the majority, but it is very rare. And
Mhm.
building that leadership confidence for women, but having structures to support them. So
Mhm.
I'm with you, uh, just on women have to be able to see that they can do it, and that they've got the support to do it. And right now
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
cards, the deck's sort of stacked. So it's like, I've got hope, though. I meet all, like you guys, I meet all these amazing
Mhm.
women. It's like, okay, what can I do to help them see? And that's the whole idea of this podcast, is for women to see how other women, what they're doing, but how do they navigate that? And for them to be able to see, oh,
Mhm.
I could do that, or I'm going to reach out to her, so it's
Mhm.
giving women permission to do that and, explore. So
Mhm.
I love
Mhm.
where you're at on that. And that's our whole basis for starting this organization, is getting
Mhm.
more women in actual decision-making leadership roles,
Mhm.
budget policy, all those
Mhm.
pieces. So
Mhm.
so I love it. And I think that's why I think we're closely aligned. And just,
Mhm.
you know, building on the strength of rural women. And when you think about rural women in leadership, sort of going into that piece of things, what do you wish more people understood? I know we touched about it a little bit, but what about those rural women leaders? What do you think? What would you like to see more people understand about rural women leading?
Well, I can start. I think what I wish more people understood about this is rural women, but women in general,
Mhm.
is that the leadership styles are often dismissed as soft when they're actually what makes communities resilient. And so, um, and all these things happen in real places every day, right? The collaboration, relationship to building, thinking about whole communities rather than siloed outcomes. And these approaches are aligned with the way women lead when they're being true to themselves. And are the way a lot of our leadership out in rural areas right now is set up is there's not really space for these sorts of behaviors and for this sort of way of leading. Um, so I think I just trust what we already know. They're experts in their communities. Um, you know, and stop making us prove it, in ways that are designed for different genders and different contexts. Um, you know, we're the ones leading, holding communities together, running the childcare centers, home health organizations, the food shelves, volunteer networks. There's all sorts of leadership happening, even when it's invisible to people measuring impact in conventional ways.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we've sort of noticed working with Chantel, the childcare director, is that making her realize you are already a leader. What you're doing is already leading, and just kind of building on what you're already doing. There's already leadership happening. You might not recognize it as such, and other people might be around you might not be calling it that or recognizing it. But it very much is leadership.
Yeah,
Mhm,
absolutely. I always my mantra is women are leading every day. Women are the backbone of
Mhm.
communities, but they quite often are not at the table where the formal
Mhm.
decisions are being made. So it's really like how do
mhm,
we get more women in formal leadership? And
mhm,
I think that's a huge gap. and
mhm,
and but I think the more we can get women to connect and learn about each other and see how we can all help each other, the better.
mhm,
And for women to see how women are navigating leadership in different ways, formal leadership. It just, in our initial research, which I'm a huge believer, I know you guys are research based, but in our initial research, that's really what we learned is women want to learn from other women's journeys because it's a
Mhm.
great way for them to see a model or see a path or see a way that someone's been able to overcome something. So when you think about, you guys have just led rich lives now, doing amazing work, and it's just such an honor to know you and to be able to talk to you today and be able to share your story. What advice would you offer to your younger self? And another part of that is when we think about young women trying to build lives in rural, you know, what advice do you have for them? So I know that's sort of a two-parter, but it's a big interest of mine.
As this was going on, I was thinking, what would I have even listened as a younger person to my older self talking to me? Probably not, because I was stubborn.
mhm,
But in the event that I would tell my younger self to take happiness seriously, to prioritize that, and to take risks. I grew
mhm,
up in a family where survival trumped happiness. It mattered more than happiness. So I learned to treat happiness as a luxury rather than something to plan for. And my late husband pushed me throughout our 18 years of marriage to think differently. Um, Even when I felt like I needed to be a sensible one, like, okay, this, he can think about happiness, but I've got to be, thinking sensibly. Um, and it was only after his death that I was able to act on that perspective that he had of prioritizing happiness. And acting on that perspective eventually led me to leave my job at Rutgers, and to start Rural Pathways with Stacy. So I would definitely encourage my younger self and all younger women to think seriously about happiness, as a way of life and not as a luxury. And I think for young women in rural places in particular, my advice to take risks is not necessarily about being impulsive. It's about sort of recognizing when stability becomes a way of avoiding change and taking calculated risks. Whether that means changing jobs, starting something new, walking away from a path that is not working or fitting at the moment. I think that's how more honest and sustainable lives get built. And I live in reality. I know that taking risks is hard, and it's frightening. But very often they pay off if they're calculated.
Yeah, gosh. I hear so much of what you're saying, Charity. Uh, so to my younger self, it would be to trust the winding path. You know, not every role will feel like the thing, but each one teaches you something that you'll need later. And it's just the way life is. In the moment, you won't know or be able to identify that. But the skills from my first job, detasseling corn. That's a thing you do growing up in Iowa. If you don't know what that is, you can Google it. From teaching third grade, from special education administration, from the hours and hours sitting in front of my computer getting my PhD, the relationships built across, different communities. None of it was wasted. It all converges eventually. So, to young women in rural places, your roots are not limitations, they're really foundations. And it's okay to have a love hate relationship with where you grew up. Our society caters to urban, and rural is second best in many people's eyes. And so, a lot of times, young people, when we, leave our rural area to go, to college or to go, to that urban place that's supposed to be so great, we try to bury some of that. I did that. The way I talked, the way I dressed, everything. Um, and the people that think, rural is second best, well, they've usually never lived in these special places. I think that's what we need to understand. It's not that they're bad or they're trying to be mean or they're not getting it. They just don't have that lived experience, right? And so the deep knowledge you have of your community, the relationships you've built over the years, the understanding of how things actually work on the ground, that's the expertise. And don't let anyone convince you that you need to leave to matter. But I'll be honest, like I said, I went through my own reckoning with my rural roots. And I think through rural pathways, I've rekindled my bond with rural places. Rural pathways has helped me, reconnect with my people. I've learned that I live in Duluth. I live in a more urban area, but I'm actually very comfortable, and maybe the most comfortable when I'm out working with people in communities of 300 and sitting and helping them with things because I get that. It's very familiar to me. I grew up with that. So find your people and build networks that extend beyond your immediate geography. Seek out mentors who have navigated similar paths. Teresa has been one of those for me. Offer mentorship to those coming behind you. This work is and life is a marathon. So pace yourself. Don't look at what others are doing. Don't look at the templates that they put out there, especially for us women. Stay connected to what grounds you. Remember, you don't have to do it alone, and you don't have to do it all at once.
Those are such good comments. And when you were talking about living in Duluth, when we started 100 Rural Women, of course, my first thing was I'm going to do 100 meetings across the state because I wanted to find out, how could we add value and how do you overcome barriers? What are the challenges? And some of the pushback that I got from women in some of our rural regional centers was interesting. And I get it because some of these are bigger communities in rural. Might be classified as an urban area, but it's rural geography, and it's still distance from urban, and it's our regional economic center. So we did meetings across the state in 87 counties because every county in Minnesota has rural geography except Ramsey. But when Ramsey County, where our state capital is, there are so many people that either are from rural, work in rural. That's where a lot of, rural organizations are. So we really saw, the whole state, everybody has that. Either people who grew up in rural and are, living in the metro, whatever. But it's an interesting thing when you think of that definition of rural. And I just think also just reflecting on some of the things you guys said about stability. And I remember staying in some positions I needed to leave, but it was that stability piece and the fear of like, oh, if I leave this, what am I going to do? And now when I look back, because I am old and I've gotten to do a lot of really cool things over my career, those are the best decisions I made when I left. Maybe not financially the best, but personally the best. I just really appreciate you guys joining me today and being part of our podcast as we launch our podcast and taking your time to share your thoughts. Do you have any closing thoughts before we shut her down today? I just really, I really appreciate getting to work with you guys and you taking your time out of your busy schedules to be with us today.
I would just encourage women to be deliberate about taking care of themselves, about self-care and trying to take breaks and step away from heavy work or work that feels overwhelming. Um, Stacy and I often do something we jokingly call the night shift. So, if we have a lot of work or heavy work, that will work during the day, we'll take a break and then we'll both do a night shift at home. So finding a schedule that works for you, especially if you're an entrepreneur, is a wonderful thing. So take care of yourself.
Mhm. And along with that, part of taking care of yourself is um, find spaces and roles, especially thinking about work, jobs. You spend the majority of your waking hours, right, in those spaces where you can be who you are and you don't have to make yourself smaller. Um, I got pushed to the brink a few years ago, and I had to leave a very unhealthy job in higher ed. Um, and it was the best thing I ever did. And since then, I look back at who that person was and who I am now, and um, I feel for that person that was kept in the box, had these guardrails put around them all the time, was doing too much research, was talking too loudly, was having too much fun, was all these things. And so I was trying to all the time put myself back into this box, and I was never going to find the box in a job. It's okay to leave those jobs. You don't want to be reckless, but as I got older and as I started to, I guess, to take less shit. Sorry, I just swore on your podcast. But I found then I couldn't stay in unhealthy jobs, and unfortunately, the reality is a lot of jobs are unhealthy for women. It's not
Yeah.
you, and they'll make it think it's you. So start to plan, start to make your own plans if you're in that sort of thing, and find a network and find mentors and people that have done that before that can help you, because many of us women have done that. You talk to women entrepreneurs, you talk to Teresa, anyone that have started organizations that have done things. It's because out of an intense need to be able to be who we want to be, who we are, and to do work aligned with our values.
Absolutely. And it just brings to mind a story of when I left a position, and my daughter, I think she was about 10 at the time, and we were meeting with one of the women that worked for me, and she was getting recruited, and I was like, you need to go. You need to go. And because I knew I was probably not going to be there much longer. And I just remember my daughter saying to her, we were at dinner, they don't value my mom there. And I thought, okay, here's this 10-year-old telling somebody they don't value my mom. And I'm like, oh, that's right.
Wow.
So yeah, it's interesting. And now trying to figure out how to help her through, what all the things, all the trials and tribulations she goes through with her career is amazing. But well, I want to thank you guys again. You've given us so much time and wisdom, and thanks for all you're doing. And just really appreciate you. And keep up the good work. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this. And thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Take care.